As Dom suggested, this presentation is based on the postscript, or what will be the postscript of my forthcoming book. I decided not to call it a conclusion because it struck me that coming to any sort of conclusion about politics on these islands at the moment seems redundant or even silly. So I thought I'd call it a postscript instead. What is contained in this presentation is based in part on follow-up interviews that I conducted this year with several key respondents whom I had interviewed at various intervals over the duration of my research on the centennial commemorations, in particular of the Somme, as it was commemorated in particular by Ulster Loyalists last year in 2016. Participant observation of some of the commemorative activity that took place last year, and some of my own kind of thoughts, observations, questions. I don't claim, let's get that caveat in now, I don't claim to know necessarily all of the answers to some of the questions that I am posing in ways that I hope will become clear, and to which I hope I will have answers within the next 3 years following my time in Cork. So these are some general reflections on 2016. I suppose the anthropologist's privilege is I get to tell you my kind of opinion and pretend that it's kind of academically rigorous, and sorry to all the anthropologists in the room here. Some of my observations on the place of commemoration in politics on this island and across these islands in 2016 and vice versa, with a focus on Unionist and Loyalist commemorations in Northern Ireland in particular, but some more general observations about commemoration and politics from 2016 into this year. And as I said, this talk is based in part on several key interviews I did with kind of key respondents, reflecting on their experiences of 2016. And I suppose that my starting point is that politics in 2016 in Northern Ireland wasn't ever really about commemoration, or wasn't in the end about commemoration in the way that many of us thought that it would be in the build-up to that big centennial year. Watching him announce his government's plans for the First World War centenary at the Imperial War Museum in 2012, who would have anticipated that it would be a much diminished David Cameron who would eventually be laying the centennial wreath at the Somme's Thiepval Memorial mere days after losing a referendum on the UK's continued membership of the European Union had resulted in his resignation as Prime Minister. In the run-up to 2016, nowhere was it predicted that by the end of the centennial year, there would be as much, if not greater, political capital for Sinn Féin in a botched renewable energy scheme than in commemoration of the Irish Republic's sacrificial founding during Easter week. I've been toying with some version of Read It, because Sinn Féin's kind of slogan during 2016 was "Join the Rising," join the RH Rising. I don't know if there's some wordplay in there for a title for a future article or something. In the event, politics in Northern Ireland, as I've suggested in 2016, weren't, in my opinion, really about commemoration at all. As the centenaries themselves recede into memory, perhaps historians will ask what all the fuss, such as it was, had been about. Whether the dedication of all of those column inches, journal pages, conference papers, miles in Dom's car listening to Waterboys CDs, travelling to various conferences across the island, and all of this exhaustive discussion about history, anthropology, about the academic confrontation with commemoration during the decade of centenaries had been strictly necessary. More likely, those historians will be far too preoccupied dissecting the more enduring political shifts and upheavals by which the centennial commemorations of both the Easter Rising and the Battle of the Somme have been arguably eclipsed. It would always have been a truism to say that Northern Irish politics in 2017 was not what it had been when I began my research in 2013. But the rate and scale of change has felt precipitous, vast, and at times overwhelming. Elections to local councils and the European Parliament, 3 seminal referenda on the issues of Scottish independence, marriage equality, and Brexit, respectively, 1 Irish, 2 UK general elections within the space of 2 years, and 2 Northern Ireland Assembly elections only 9 months apart, have both mirrored and resulted in rapid and unpredictable realignments of political gravity across these islands. The deaths of both Ian Paisley and Martin McGuinness have provided space in which to reflect on the profound political, social and cultural transformations which have characterised post-conflict Northern Ireland. Conversely, ongoing paramilitary violence, the ascendant politics of language, culture and identity, impasse on issues such as sexual equality and reproductive rights, the resurgent question of the border and the collapse of power sharing have all raised questions about the true extent, longevity and trajectory of those transformations. More broadly, Brexit, the election of Donald Trump to the office of President of the United States, and the rise of the so-called post-truth regime in Western political culture have shaken the foundations of the international neoliberal consensus and its Northern Irish avatars, with thanks to McCabe and to McLaughlin and Baker, the double transition and its propaganda of peace. Given the intensity of this political cultural ferment, at this distance I feel it's difficult to judge with any great precision the impact or consequences, either short or longer term, of 2016's centennial commemorations, of either the Easter Rising or of the Battle of the Somme. Some of the worst fears evoked by the ghosts of 1966 about their likely association with violence appear not to have been borne out, though the murder of prison officer Adrian Ismay by the dissident New IRA in March 2016 was explicitly linked by PSNI investigators to an increase in the group's activity in the run-up to the centenary of the Rising. Generally, though not unanimously, official marking of the centenaries has been heralded by the political, academic and media establishments on both sides of the Irish Sea as having been broadly and sufficiently solemn, reconciliatory and embracing of all traditions on the island. I can tell I'm an anthropologist. Everything in here is in scare quotes. Predominant themes in public commentary on the commemorations have included celebration of their historical accuracy and self-congratulation for having maturely avoided replicating the supposed mistakes or triumphalism of what Conor Cruise O'Brien accused the 1966 Golden Jubilees. There can be little doubt, I think, as to the broad appeal of official approaches to the 1916 centenaries. It is evidenced by the literally thousands of commemorative events organised in the main and at the local level across the island of Ireland in 2016. Much of this vernacular commemorative activity sought to explore individual, familial and communal connections to the events of 1916 and indeed the period 1912 to 1923 more widely. North and south of the border, an expansive range of lectures, panel discussions, workshops and exhibitions were supported by a boom in publications by historians covering myriad aspects of 1916, and in the availability of digital and digitised resources, including for teaching, community projects, and to support genealogical research. It was great. Everyone wanted articles, and so I'm going to have to think of how to kind of keep that train going, I guess. Fintan O'Toole has suggested that also in 2016, Official Ireland trusted its artists, to take a headline from an article of his in the Irish Times. Lauding both the quantity and quality of artistic production during the centenary, he proposed that, quote, perhaps for the first time in its history, the state gave artists the floor and left them to their own devices, trusting them to come up with responses to 1916 that would somehow hit the right note. Implicit in his trust is the embrace of a literal revisionism. Art, if it is any good, is always a revisioning of the given materials, in this case the Rising and its legacy. So defined were the 2016 commemorations by the levels of public engagement with artistic, theatrical and literary reappraisals of 1916 that this cultural creativity was identified by the Irish government as the key achievement of the centenary year. A legacy programme called Creative Ireland was launched in December last year with the express aim of building on the success of the centenary and, quote, mainstreaming creativity in the life of the nation. Its creativity was also seen as having been intimately associated with another of the key perceived successes of the centenary, its multivocality and firm commitment to narrative plurality and inclusivity. In line broadly, I argue, with the prediction made by Hartfield and Rooney in their polemic Who's Afraid of the Easter Rising, the architects of the centenary had, quote, given up on trying to control the event and had chosen instead to decenter and dilute it. Perhaps paradoxically, the devolution of commemoration to local communities, and thereby the encouragement of a creative, island-wide commemorative cacophony, seems to have allowed for greater narrative control than would have been possible under similar conditions of tighter state management, such as had prevailed in various forms and on both sides of the border in 66, 76 or 1991. Particular forms of critique or dissidence were, I felt, often absorbed, crowded out, or rendered otherwise indiscernible by the sheer volume of commemorative activity, much of it lacking explicitly political content or even revelling in its apoliticism. And I found it. I found the photo. For example, wandering around RTE's busy, sprawling, and undoubtedly quite enjoyable, we agreed in the best tradition of 10 Things I Hate About You that the day was on balance quite whelming. I think, Dom, if you recall, it was a whelming day.
It was a whelming day.
We had ice cream, it was fun, it was great, I really enjoyed it. This quite enjoyable reflecting the rising jamboree in Dublin on Easter Monday 2016, it was often difficult to discern what precisely the many pageants, performances, and in one particularly perplexing exhibit, horticultural displays, had to say about 1916 at all. If the peace propagandists' relative success in their attempts to wrest control of the commemorative agenda from other expressly political interests can largely and maybe counterintuitively be attributed to the democratization of the centenary, it should be noted that this also did rely, in part, on processes of circumscription, prohibition, and co-option. For example, as part of their programme of commemorative events for 2016, Sinn Féin had included a proposed Son et Lumière production on the facade of the GPO, but the plans were rejected by An Post after it had been the Postal Service had been leaned on by Communications Minister Alex White. Because of their overtly party political nature, these were prohibited. It is important too to note the ways in which discord, dissent and division, the political as such, nonetheless found ways to intrude into the centenaries of 1916. The politics of gender, for example, was foregrounded in the aftermath of the Abbey Theatre's announcement of its programme for 2016. Entitled Waking the Nation, it contained only one play written by a woman and only 3 directed by women. In response, and through a series of discussions both on and offline, a group of theatre professionals came together under the banner of #Waking the Feminists to put pressure on the Abbey Theatre and other cultural institutions to develop comprehensive policies on gender equality. Waking the Feminists evolved into a broad-based social movement which has achieved some considerable and, I think, enduring successes in challenging malignant forms of misogyny and male domination of the arts in Ireland. What I think is really interesting about Waking the Feminists is kind of indicative of the particular forms of co-option, or some of the particular forms of co-option at the heart of official commemorations of 1916, such as the impact of Waking the Feminists, that footage of its protests have been included in almost all retrospectives of the centenary, including films produced by Ireland 2016, like this one, which I meant to play in the background so you'd have some nice moving images with my words, but I forgot to do that. So that film features, and in their official publication marking the centenaries, Waking the Feminists features highly, despite its origins as a sort of anti-movement. Throughout the centenary year, other divisive ghosts continue to stalk the commemorative landscape, and there were moments when the political dissociations between British and Irish, unionist and nationalist, threatened decisively to reveal themselves, including in a controversy around the so-called necrology wall in Glasnevin Cemetery, which you may remember scenes of the Canadian ambassador tackling a protester who was protesting against the unveiling of this wall, which lists side by side soldiers, British soldiers, civilians, and Republicans killed during the Rising, which was condemned by all shades of republicanism. In Northern Ireland, at the outset of the centenary year, newly anointed leader of the DUP, soon-to-be First Minister Arlene Foster, ruled out participating in any event she deemed to be a celebration of the Easter Rising. In an interview with the Impartial Reporter, she termed the Rising a direct attack on the state to which I owe my allegiance. I don't think I'd be invited, but even if I was, I certainly would not be going to commemorate an attack on the United Kingdom. True to her word, Foster did not accept the invitation to attend the state ceremony in Dublin on Easter Sunday. Unionist councillors followed her lead and chose to boycott a civic dinner held to commemorate the Rising at Belfast City Hall. This, in turn, led to Irish President Michael D. Higgins pulling out of the event, which he had understood to have enjoyed cross-party support. Coupled with loyalist rejection of the reconciliatory overtures of Sinn Féin's 2016 visit to the battlefields of the Somme and Flanders as insincere, callous and politically jarring, these boycotts created pockets of deconstructive repoliticisation of the centenary commemorations, however fleeting or transitory. This doesn't have any particular relationship with what I'm about to say next, but I enjoyed the image so much that I thought I'd put it back up. As noted by William, one of my key respondents during my research and who I interviewed again earlier this year, by and large, in his view, loyalist commemorations in 2016 proceeded in parallel with official commemorative programmes north and south. He suggested that in his view, these programmes, and we discussed in particular Belfast City Council's Belfast Somme 100 project, amounted to, quote, a pretty formidable bunch of stuff. To what degree loyalism found itself involved in it is another matter. Loyalism did what loyalism does. You know, it put crosses in the ground, banned parades and things like that. I think at the end of the day, people didn't necessarily flock to City Hall to hear all of the lectures and stuff. He spoke specifically about one event he attended at Belfast City Hall in 2016, a hedge school organised by the Fellowship of Messines Association, in which he noticed that, quote, they managed to get, as these guys do, a bit of a cross-community audience. Some loyalists were there, but the talks proceeded right the way through. It was a Somme 100 event, right? One speaker talked about women, but there was hardly any mention of the Somme. Another talked about nationalism. I realised these loyalist guys were there sitting in the audience, had been there for an hour, and there had been no mention whatsoever of anything to do with the Somme, really, to be honest. The perpetuation of what I and others have termed the greening of the Great War, and an emphasis on the 16th Irish Division's role in the latter stages of the Battle of the Somme, appear to have been key features of official commemorative events, which sought to stress the cross-communal sharedness of 1916's sacrifice, with which I've been taking umbrage since 2013. This having been said, it should nonetheless be noted that none of the official programming sought to hold back a tide of loyalist commemoration, which reached its high watermark in June and July of 2016. Indeed, several prominent loyalists were themselves involved in developing the Belfast Somme 100 programme, highlighted by William, and included in the events of this programme were parades and exhibitions organised by the Orange Order and the Unionist Centenary Committee. The parade and reenactment in Woodvale Park on the 18th of June, a description of which provides the opening vignette for my book, was listed as a flagship event. As custodians of Belfast Somme 100, History Hub Ulster and Belfast City Council also worked with the parade organisers to ensure new, though very particular and militarised forms of representation of women in the parade. With some estimates putting the number of participants in the events of 18th of June 2016 in the region of 15,000, the reenactment was notable for its use of professional pyrotechnics, high production values and cinematic quality. The successes of 18th of June have been widely heralded by all of my respondents, but they nonetheless came a very poor second to the main event, the centennial pilgrimage to the former battlefields of the Western Front. Indeed, the parade and reenactment had been organised on the 18th of June, some 2 weeks before the centenary, on the 1st of July, precisely so as not to interfere with the travel plans of those making the journey to the Somme for the 1st of July. Sammy, another one of my key respondents, estimated that at least 1,000 men and women travelled from Northern Ireland to participate in commemorative events organised by the 36th Ulster Division Memorial Association in France and Belgium. These included wreath-laying ceremonies at the 36th Ulster and 16th Irish Division Memorial Stones on the outskirts of the village of Waichete, and a parade from Ypres Cloth Hall to the Menin Gate on the evening of the 30th of June. Most, though not all, of those participating in these events had also been allocated tickets in a public ballot for the ceremony hosted by the Somme Association at the Ulster Tower on the 1st of July itself. As I've expressed throughout my work, there had been fears that on the part of some of my respondents, that the pomp and bureaucracy of official ceremonies in France in 2016 would result in, or even be designed to ensure, people effectively being excluded from them. As it transpired, strict restrictions were imposed on those attending the Ulster Tower on the 1st of July 2016, though they were perhaps of a different magnitude and nature to those that had been anticipated. In the wake of a series of terror attacks, including shootings and bombings, which had claimed the lives of 130 people in Paris in November 2015, attendees were subjected to a rigorous and heightened regime of security checks, searches and controls. Thomas, one of my respondents who had travelled to the Somme for the 1st of July ceremony at the Ulster Tower, gave a thick description of an experience which he termed kaleidoscopic, vivid, multisensory and perhaps a little overwhelming. This is an extensive quote from him. The amount of effort we had to go through to get there, big bus journey with so many buses. We were conscious of the big thing happening over at the Thiepval Memorial, and they were driving past us. There was the Archbishop of Canterbury driving and walking around, all these other dignitaries. I was very conscious of all of that going on. It was over there somehow. You could hear the sounds of it going on as we were at the tower. And the whole ceremonial thing was so orange. People were wearing their collarettes from early in the day. I looked around and I knew so many people. The orange, all the Somme societies were there. It was like transportation of loyalism to this site. And then, whenever the royalty turned up, there were barriers all along. The royalty went by, shaking hands, all the rest of it. People were going off into the cornfields to get pictures of themselves with the poppies in the cornfields. And then someone was saying to me, do you know, this is really part of Northern Ireland here. This is the one place where the French have allowed us to fly this flag. And all the time, endless French police. It was very militarised, helicopters in the distance. I then asked, that separation between dignitaries and other attendees, were people put out by that? No, everyone was very happy. There was reverence. People were waiting very patiently for their buses and whatever else. As highlighted by both Thomas and Sammy, the amount of time, organisational effort, and indeed money invested by those who participated in the centennial commemorations of the Battle of the Somme provide evidence of their profound and enduring pre-political and personal significance. But in addition to this, they also serve as a waymarker for what, during most of the centenary year, appeared to be a relatively ascendant trajectory for loyalism and wider unionism. There she is, on fire. In January 2016, DUP First Minister Peter Robinson departed from the political front line after cashing in the last of his dwindling political capital to secure the Fresh Start agreement. As such, the DUP went into the 2016 Assembly elections with a renewed and more popular leadership, and emerged with both the largest vote share and number of seats. The election was heralded as having been good for unionism in general, and the DUP in particular. By contrast, it was widely understood to have been a difficult election for Sinn Féin. The party experienced a 2.9% drop in its first preference vote share, a net loss of 1 seat, falling voter turnout in core constituencies including West Belfast and Foyle, and an insurgent challenge on the left flank from People Before Profit. The summer of 2016 saw thousands of Northern Ireland football fans travel to France to watch their team perform unexpectedly well at the UEFA European Championship, gaining reputation and indeed an award for their infectious enthusiasm, love for the game and for their team, Will Griggs on Fire, a supporters chant about Northern Ireland's star striker, sung to the tune of Gala's 1996 dance hit Freed From Desire, became an anthem of the tournament as a whole. Following a relatively peaceful marching season, and as the anger of the flag protests of 2012 and 2013 continued to dissipate, an accommodation was reached between the Orange Order and the Crumlin and Ardoyne Residents Association, which ended the Twadell Parade's impasse. The protest camp was dismantled and the Ligonil Lodges completed the return leg of their 2013 parade in October 2016. I should say, in particular in reference to the football, for many of my respondents, and one key respondent in particular, it was the European Championship and not the centenary which provided the most significant emotive experiences and enduring memories of 2016. The Somme commemorations appear to have been somewhat of an anticlimax by comparison. Perhaps most significantly, the unanticipated victory of the campaigns in favour of leaving the EU in the UK-wide referendum on the 23rd of June last year appeared to herald at the national level the vindication of a loyalist cultural and political project defined by its post-colonial melancholia and the attendant rejection of forms of globalisation, multiculturalism and liberal cosmopolitanism. In the lead-up to the referendum, a mural appeared in the Tigers Bay area of North Belfast imploring residents to vote Leave EU. The mural included a reference to a biblical passage, Revelations 18:4, which urges, "Come out of her, my people, that ye not be partakers of her sins, and that ye receive not of her plagues." Among the 52% of voters across the UK who eventually elected to leave the EU were 60% of Protestant voters in Northern Ireland. Of Northern Ireland's 18 constituencies, 7, all areas of Protestant majority, had majorities for Leave. Analysis of an ESRC survey of over 4,000 Northern Irish participants in the referendum, conducted by John Garry and John Coakley, whose work continues to be the only thing, I think, that sheds any light on what's actually going on. That's not true, and Katie Hayward's work too. Just a bit of a plug for stuff about Brexit, why not? Revealed that a majority of supporters of the two main unionist political parties, the pro-Leave DUP and even the pro-Remain UUP, voted Leave, as did, perhaps less surprisingly, the majority of TUV supporters. Crucially, Garry and Coakley found that of the working class Protestants in Northern Ireland who voted in the referendum, fully 71% put their crosses in the Leave box. Describing his feelings about the referendum results, Garry, a key respondent, remembered fondly that, "I'll tell you what, you see the next day after the vote, I didn't think the vote was going to go in our favour. I was driving home and I happened to look up at the sky and a big grin came over my face. And I just felt for the first time of being or having a sense of freedom which I had never felt before. I didn't feel like my vote counted that much, but suddenly now I feel like the country is ours again." The celebratory mood would, however, be short-lived. From the outset, loyalist satisfaction with the referendum result was awkwardly juxtaposed to the inconvenient truth that a majority in Northern Ireland, as well as a majority in Scotland, and a very substantial, angry and vocal minority, in which I count myself, across the UK as a whole, had voted Remain. Amidst the ensuing lack of clarity about what Brexit really means, ambiguity as to its consequences for the UK's only land border, and uncertainty about the future shape of trading, diplomatic and geopolitical relationships between the UK and its European neighbours, the border, the spectre of partition and the constitutional question have once again become salient in Northern Irish politics in a way not seen since the height of the Troubles. As suggested by William, quote, "It had not looked so long ago like Sinn Féin's vote was going down, and it was going down. And that was because people were getting comfortable. People on the nationalist side of the fence seemed quite happy in a Northern Ireland within the UK, and maybe even to be getting happier. And now that's been reversed. It's all the more of a shock. And Brexit is part of that, because Brexit here is not so much about, loads of Romanians coming to Kent and Essex or flooding Boston and Lincolnshire. Brexit here is going to mean the border at the end of the day. That's where it's going to be really problematic. And I think in its heart and core, loyalism is worried about that, worried about what that might entail. If the Brexit referendum result had already represented somewhat of a Pyrrhic victory for the Loyalist political project, then events of late 2016 and early 2017 were nothing short of a crisis. And I won't go into the full details of the Cash for Ash scandal because I'm sure we're all very well versed in them. But suffice it to say, Arlene Foster, facing sustained criticism for her belligerent, bellicose and uncompromising handling of the affair, she sustained belligerent, bellicose, she sustained criticism for those things. Eventually, following repeated demands for Foster to temporarily step down as First Minister while an inquiry examined the bungled scheme, and also in the wake of a decision by DUP Communities Minister Paul Given to cut a £50,000 Gaeltacht bursary scheme for Irish language learners in December of 2016, Martin McGuinness, the late Martin McGuinness, resigned his position as Deputy First Minister in January 2017, effectively unseating Foster and collapsing the devolved institutions. There followed several weeks of campaigning the Crocodile's Gaffe, which was a spectacular own goal for the DUP leader. The 2017 Assembly election saw a rapid reversal of the electoral fortunes which had prevailed in 2016. And crucially, Loyalism had lost its majority in the Northern Ireland Assembly, and for the first time since the state was founded, Unionist candidates failed to gain a majority either of votes cast or seats available in an election in Northern Ireland. Neatly summarising the nature of the position in which Loyalism and Unionism more widely found itself following the Assembly election in 2017, Sammy lamented, and this is a bit blue, everyone, be warned, the simple fact is that in 2016, Unionism was in a position of strength. Unionism in 2017 is fucking not in a position of strength. It's been fucked by the political parties, and even in the general election, they fucked us as well. The DUP made an absolute Horlicks of the Assembly elections. The UUP made a Horlicks of the Assembly elections in how they presented themselves and in what they said. They didn't give leadership. They made bollocks after bollocks after bollocks and just made themselves out to be total and utter fools. And we paid the price for that. Then in the general election, for example, in South and East Belfast, they're running two candidates. And there's a distinct possibility the SDLP will retain South Belfast. And in East Belfast, maybe the Alliance Party will get in. Instead of having two safe Unionist seats, my fear is we won't have any. In the event, both of those seats did return Unionist MPs. The electoral success of a resurgent Irish republicanism was largely, I would argue, unanticipated during most of the centenary year. And it has resulted in an intensive process of soul-searching within the, quote, PUL community, and been met with renewed calls for Unionist unity. In particular, the DUP's claims that they are best and perhaps uniquely placed to guarantee the long-term security of Northern Ireland's position in the United Kingdom appear to be gaining traction. Ahead of the 2017 general election, the Loyalist Communities Council issued a statement urging Unionist and Loyalist voters to cast their votes for the DUP over other Unionist candidates in 3 key marginal seats. Following a disastrous election for Prime Minister Theresa May and the loss of the Conservatives' parliamentary majority, having succeeded in increasing their share of the vote by more than 10% since 2015, and with a net gain of 2 seats, taking their total to 10 in the House of Commons, the DUP's new position as kingmakers in a hung parliament may yet signal that the pendulum is swinging back in Unionism's favour, at least in the short to medium term. Though, as Dominic and I discussed extensively last night over a couple of pints, it's fair to say, there's an interest. What is interesting about the DUP's current position is the uncoupling of the economic interests of Northern Ireland from the interests of identity, which I'm happy and hopefully we can discuss in what follows. However, the longer-term trajectory is still far from certain. Unionism failed to regain its electoral majority in the 2017 general election, and it is unclear when or if it will ever do so, particularly given contemporary demographic trends and the renascent issue of the border. It should not be assumed, as it has been in some quarters, that either an increase in Catholic population or a new regime of customs checks will lead inevitably to a united Ireland. Likewise, the threat which Brexit poses to the peace process makes for sensational headlines which I think tend to misrepresentation or overstatement, and sometimes that's quite gratuitous overstatement. But Brexit has certainly reshaped the politics of Northern Ireland drastically and rapidly, reactivating and recalibrating longer-running conflicts and deeper-seated animosities. At the time of writing, it remains ambiguous as to whether the current climate will be conducive to establishing a new, durable power-sharing executive. Against this backdrop, loyalist factionalism and paramilitary feuding have claimed 3 lives since August 2016, while ongoing conflicts in and over the symbolic landscape, and in 2017 the issue of 11th night bonfires was particularly vexatious, have sustained and renewed loyalist claims about culture war. Concurrently, a steady stream of ongoing revelations about collusion between loyalist paramilitaries, the police and security services during the Troubles have raised new and profoundly troubling questions about Northern Ireland's sordid past and the nature of loyalism's relationship with the state. For me, such revelations as the extent of this relationship and the seemingly pathological violence at its heart also raises further ethical concerns as to the legitimate extent of the already qualified empathy I have argued it is possible or desirable to extend to Ulster loyalism. Where and how the remaining centenaries sit within this context, I think, is unclear. The much vaunted conciliatory potential of the centenary of the 1917 Battle of Messines, at which the 36th and 16th Irish divisions fought, quote, side by side, appears to have been overtaken by events. A joint Anglo-Irish ceremony was held at the Island of Ireland Peace Park on the 7th of June this year, and participants included Prince William, Taoiseach Enda Kenny, and representatives from across the Northern Irish political spectrum. However, Messine's place in the news cycle, which on the very evening before a UK general election, was at any rate fairly marginal, and was defined as much by its being Enda Kenny's last overseas engagement as Taoiseach as by its reconciliatory symbolism. Already likely to be more highly charged, upcoming centenaries will surely be all the more politically fraught in the current political climate. In particular, the centenary of partition of the founding of the Northern Irish state in 2021 is bound to take on an enhanced significance for Ulster loyalists seeking to reassert their status as integral members of a union which is itself in a state of flux. The DUP have made the marking of this centenary a key policy commitment in subsequent elections. Led by a reinvigorated and rejuvenated Unionist Centenary Committee, discussions are already underway at the grassroots as to how the centenary of partition can be marked with, quote, a view to ensuring that Northern Ireland's membership of the UK is guaranteed for another 100 years, end quote, from Sammy, one of my key respondents. I'm heading towards a conclusion now. How am I doing for time? Pretty good. Perfect. I won't need it all. During our follow-up interview in 2017, William and I discussed a lot of things. One of them was one of his recent projects, which had involved a visit to the Somme battlefields following the 1st of July ceremonials. His description of the experience was arresting and posed if not the essentially important question for loyalism and its politics of commemoration in the final years of the decade of centenaries. Quote, it was grey and there was nobody there. You'd had this huge crowd on the 1st of July and now there was nobody there. And suddenly it felt more real, far, far more real than all the pomp and stuff. What has happened is this corporatization of the whole thing. If you compare the poetry on the Ulster Tower to the poetry on Helen's Tower, one is Ulster's grief, which is taken over from personal grief. It's a colder thing, that. And I thought, we've had the Somme 2016, what's next? Will loyalism forget about it or move on from it? Or will it seek to continue with it? I think people will always come here to remember, but things have changed. There's Brexit and there's the alterations there. Courage is required of loyalists at this moment. Courage was required of the men who came up these slopes with bayonets and guns. What's required now of unionism and loyalism? What is required now for the future? What is required now for a changed world? End quote. Loyalist commemoration of the Somme may have reached its apotheosis in July 2016, and its ghosts may even have enjoyed a little respite in the days and weeks following. But in a world transformed, the ghost dance will surely continue. What new forms and meanings will it manifest in an uncertain, unstable future? For now, only the ghosts are given to know.